Before we begin tonight's terrifying true story, I want you to think about the last time you were responsible for someone else's children in their home. That weight of responsibility, being trusted with the most precious things in another family's life, surrounded by their personal belongings in spaces you don't fully understand. Tonight's story will change how you think about that trust forever. This comes from Emma, who was 17 when she took what seemed like the perfect babysitting job, watching two well-behaved children in a beautiful Westchester County mansion for parents who paid extremely well and promised she'd never have to deal with any problems. As I tell you Emma's story, remember that this really happened, and it reveals how the families we trust most can sometimes be hiding the most dangerous secrets. My name is Emma, and I thought I'd found the perfect babysitting job when the Hendersons contacted me through my high school's job board. They lived in one of those stunning Westchester County mansions that you see in movies about wealthy New York families, the kind of house with a circular driveway, perfectly manicured gardens, and enough rooms that you could get lost trying to find the bathroom. Mrs. Henderson had explained over the phone that they needed someone reliable to watch their two children, Sophie and Michael, ages 8 and 6, while they attended various social events and business dinners that were part of Mr. Henderson's work in finance. The pay was incredible, 3 times what other families in the area offered, and the children were reportedly so well behaved that previous babysitters had described the job as the easiest money you'll ever make. Mrs. Henderson had been very specific about that point during our phone interview, emphasizing that Sophie and Michael went to bed at 8 o'clock sharp and slept through the night without any problems. "You'll essentially be paid to do your homework in our living room," she'd said, with a laugh that sounded slightly forced even over the phone. My first night at the Henderson house was on a Friday in October, and everything seemed exactly as advertised. The mansion was even more impressive inside than out, with high ceilings, expensive artwork, and the kind of furniture that looked like it belonged in a museum. Sophie and Michael were polite, quiet children who seemed almost too mature for their ages, speaking in careful, measured tones and following their bedtime routine with mechanical precision. They brushed their teeth, put on their pajamas, and climbed into their beds without any of the resistance or negotiation that I'd experienced with other children I'd babysat. Mr. and Mrs. Henderson gave me a brief tour of the house, showing me where everything was located and explaining their various rules and expectations. They were an attractive couple in their early 40s, both impeccably dressed and speaking with the kind of practiced politeness that wealthy people use with service providers. Mrs. Henderson showed me the emergency contact numbers posted on the refrigerator, the location of the first aid kit, and the children's bedroom locations. Mr. Henderson focused on the house's security system, which he described as state-of-the-art and completely automated. "The system monitors all the doors and windows," he explained, as we stood in front of a sophisticated control panel near the front entrance. "It activates automatically at 10 p.m. and stays armed until 6 a.m. All the exterior doors lock electronically when the system is active, and there are motion sensors throughout the house that will alert us if anyone tries to enter. You don't need to do anything except make sure the children stay in their rooms after bedtime. The system handles everything else." He spoke about the security measures with obvious pride, like he was showing off an expensive toy rather than explaining safety procedures. They left around 7:30 for what they described as a dinner party in the city, promising to be back by midnight at the latest. I helped the children finish their homework, supervised their bedtime routine, and by 8:15, both Sophie and Michael were asleep in their respective rooms on the second floor. The house felt enormous and slightly echoey with just me moving around downstairs, but it was also peaceful in a way that my own crowded family home never was. I settled into the living room with my calculus textbook and a cup of tea, feeling grateful for the quiet space to concentrate on my studies. The first few hours passed exactly as Mrs. Henderson had predicted. I worked through my math problems, checked on the children twice to make sure they were sleeping soundly, and enjoyed the luxury of having an entire mansion to myself. Around 10 o'clock, I heard the subtle electronic beeping that indicated the security system had activated for the night, followed by the soft click of electronic locks engaging. On all the exterior doors, the house felt sealed and protected, like a fortress that nothing could penetrate without triggering alarms and alerts. It was at exactly midnight when the phone rang. The sound was jarring in the quiet house, and my first thought was that it must be Mr. and Mrs. Henderson calling to let me know they were running late or to check that everything was going smoothly. I answered on the third ring, expecting to hear Mrs. Henderson's polite voice asking about the children. Instead, I heard something that made my blood freeze, a voice that had been electronically distorted, mechanically altered, so that it sounded neither male nor female, neither young nor old, just unnaturally flat and threatening. "Have you checked the children?" the voice asked. There was no greeting, no identification, just that simple question delivered in a tone that somehow managed to be both emotionless and menacing. I was so shocked that I couldn't respond immediately, and the voice continued, "You should check the children now." Then the line went dead, leaving me standing in the Hendersons' living room with my heart pounding and my hands shaking as I tried to process what had just happened. My first instinct was to assume it was a prank call, maybe teenagers who had randomly dialed numbers hoping to scare whoever answered. But something about the timing felt wrong. Exactly midnight, exactly when the security system had been active for 2 hours, exactly when any normal parents would be starting to think about heading home from their dinner party. I tried to convince myself it was just a coincidence, but the voice had been so specific, so focused on the children upstairs who were supposedly my responsibility. I climbed the stairs to the second floor, my footsteps seeming unnaturally loud on the hardwood steps, despite my efforts to move quietly. Sophie's room was first, and I peered through her partially open door to see her sleeping peacefully under a pink comforter, her breathing steady and undisturbed. Michael's room was across the hall, and he too was fast asleep, sprawled across his bed with a stuffed animal clutched in his arms. Both children looked exactly as they had when I'd checked on them earlier, safe and comfortable in their beds with no signs that anything was amiss. I was heading back downstairs, feeling slightly foolish for letting a prank call scare me, when the phone rang again. This time I was ready for it, and I answered immediately, prepared to tell whoever was calling that their joke wasn't funny and they needed to stop harassing me. But when I heard that same electronically distorted voice, my prepared speech died in my throat. "Did you check the children?" it asked, with exactly the same inflection as before, like it was a recording being played back. "Did you really check them carefully?" "Who is this?" I managed to ask, but the line was already dead again. I stood in the Hendersons' kitchen holding the silent phone, trying to figure out what was happening and why someone would be making these specific, targeted calls about the children I was responsible for. The timing was too precise to be random, and the focus on checking the children suggested that whoever was calling knew exactly where I was and what I was supposed to be doing. I tried calling the number Mrs. Henderson had left for emergencies, but after several rings, it went to a voicemail box that hadn't been set up, just an automated voice saying that the subscriber hadn't recorded a greeting. I tried the number again, thinking I might have misdialed, but got the same result. The business card Mr. Henderson had left with his office number went straight to voicemail as well, with a generic message saying the office was closed and to call back during business hours. The third call came at 12:23 a.m., and this time I was watching the phone, waiting for it to ring. Same distorted voice, same flat mechanical tone. "The children are not safe. You need to check them again." But this time, instead of hanging up immediately, the line stayed open. I could hear breathing on the other end, slow and deliberate, like whoever was calling was listening to my responses and enjoying my growing fear. "Where are you calling from?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "What do you want?" But there was no response, just that continued breathing and a soft sound in the background that I couldn't identify. Then I heard something that made my blood turn to ice. The faint sound of children's voices, muffled and distant like they were coming from somewhere else in the house. I dropped the phone and ran upstairs as quietly as I could, my heart hammering against my ribs as I tried to process what I'd heard. Sophie's room was still peaceful, her breathing still steady. No sign that she'd been disturbed or was in any danger. Michael's room looked exactly the same as it had during my previous check. Boy sleeping soundly, stuffed. Animal in place. Nothing out of the ordinary. But as I stood in his doorway listening, I could swear I heard voices coming from somewhere else in the house. When I crept back downstairs, the phone was still off the hook where I'd dropped it, and I could hear that mechanical breathing continuing from the receiver. I picked it up and whispered, "I checked them. They're fine. Leave us alone." The voice responded immediately, like it had been waiting for me to return. "Are you sure you checked? Everywhere? Are you sure you know where they really are?" That's when I realized something that made my legs go weak with terror. The phone calls weren't coming from outside the house. I could hear that same electronic distortion echoing faintly from somewhere else in the building, like someone was using a voice modulator device somewhere inside the mansion and calling the main phone line from an extension. The breathing I'd been hearing wasn't coming through the phone line. It was coming from inside the house, from someone who was watching me move around, listening to my conversations and timing their calls to maximize my fear and confusion. I hung up the phone and immediately went to the security system control panel that Mr. Henderson had shown me earlier. The display showed that all exterior doors and windows were still locked and that the motion sensors hadn't detected any unauthorized entry. According to the system, the house was completely secure and no one had entered from outside. But that meant whoever was making the calls had been inside all along, hidden somewhere in the mansion's many rooms, waiting for the parents to leave and the security system to activate. The phone rang again, and this time I didn't answer it. Instead, I stood next to the security panel and listened carefully, trying to pinpoint where the electronic echo was coming from. The ringing stopped after 6 rings, replaced by the faint sound of movement somewhere above me, like someone walking carefully across a floor that they knew would creak if they weren't cautious. The children's voices I'd heard earlier weren't coming from Sophie and Michael's rooms. They were coming from somewhere else in the house, somewhere I hadn't checked, because I'd assumed the Hendersons lived alone with their 2 children. I tried calling 911, but discovered that the house phone wasn't getting a dial tone. When I checked my cell phone, it showed no signal, which seemed impossible in Westchester County, where cellular coverage was generally excellent. Someone had either blocked or disabled all communication from the house, trapping me inside with the children and whoever else was sharing the space with us. The advanced security system that was supposed to protect us had become a prison, locking us in with whatever threat the Hendersons hadn't bothered to mention. The realization hit me like a physical blow. The Hendersons weren't who they claimed to be, and this wasn't a normal babysitting job. The too good to be true pay, the mechanical behavior of the children, the emphasis on the security system, the fake emergency contact numbers, everything had been designed to lure me into a situation where I would be trapped and isolated with no way to call for help or escape. I crept upstairs again, this time moving past the children's rooms toward the parts of the house I hadn't explored during the initial tour. The mansion had a 3rd floor that Mrs. Henderson had mentioned briefly, saying it was just storage and that I didn't need to worry about it. But as I climbed the narrow staircase that led to the upper level, I could hear sounds that definitely weren't coming from storage boxes. Voices, movement, and the electronic humming of equipment that suggested someone was operating sophisticated devices up there. The 3rd floor was set up like a surveillance center, with multiple monitors showing feeds from cameras throughout the house. I could see myself from earlier in the evening checking on the children, making tea in the kitchen, studying in the living room. Every moment of my time in the house had been recorded and observed. But more disturbing were the other screens showing rooms I'd never seen, where other children sat in chairs or beds, all appearing to be around the same age as Sophie and Michael. On a desk next to the monitors was the voice modulation device that had been used for the phone calls, along with a notebook filled with detailed observations about my behavior, my reactions, and my responses to the escalating psychological pressure. Someone had been conducting an experiment using me as a test subject to study how teenagers respond to isolation and manufactured fear. The phone calls, the fake emergency numbers, even the children's mechanical behavior. Everything had been carefully orchestrated to create maximum psychological distress. I heard footsteps on the stairs behind me and turned to see a man I didn't recognize climbing toward the 3rd floor. He wasn't Mr. Henderson, and he wasn't wearing the kind of expensive clothing that the supposed parents had favored. He was dressed in dark, practical clothes and moved with the confidence of someone who knew the house layout perfectly and wasn't concerned about being discovered. When he saw me standing among the surveillance equipment, he smiled the same kind of cold, predatory smile I'd seen on the faces of people who enjoyed having power over others. "You're very observant," he said, his voice normal now without the electronic distortion. "Most babysitters never make it past the 2nd phone call without breaking down completely. You lasted almost an hour longer than our previous record holder." He spoke about my terror like it was a game, a competition with scores and statistics that he'd been tracking for entertainment or research purposes. I ran past him toward the stairs, but he made no effort to stop me. "The doors are still locked," he called after me casually. "The security system won't deactivate until 6 a.m., and the phones won't work until we decide to restore communication. You can run around the house all you want, But you're not going anywhere until we're finished with our observations. I reached the children's floor and burst into Sophie's room, shaking her awake and telling her we needed to leave immediately. But instead of the confused, sleepy response I expected from a child being awakened in the middle of the night, Sophie looked at me with the same cold adult expression I'd seen on the surveillance operator's face. "You're not supposed to wake us up," she said, in that too mature voice I'd noticed earlier. "That's not part of the protocol." Michael was already awake in his room, sitting up in bed and watching me with calm, analytical eyes that belonged on someone much older. "Did you find the surveillance room?" he asked with genuine curiosity. "How long did it take you to figure out the calls were coming from?" "Inside, we've been collecting data on response times and decision-making patterns under psychological stress. These weren't children. They were young adults, maybe college age, who had been playing roles as part of whatever experiment or study was being conducted in this house. The parents weren't their parents, the emergency numbers were fake, and I'd been brought here not to babysit, but to serve as an unwilling research subject in some kind of psychological torture study. Everything I'd trusted, every assumption I'd made about the situation, had been deliberately constructed to mislead me. I tried every door and window on the first floor, but the security system had indeed locked everything electronically. The windows were reinforced with some kind of security film that prevented them from being broken, and the doors had electronic locks that couldn't be opened manually. I was trapped in a mansion that had been converted into a laboratory, with people who viewed my fear and desperation as data points to be recorded and analyzed. The phone rang again, and this time when I answered it, I heard my own voice played back to me, recordings of everything I'd said during the previous calls, edited together to create a conversation between me and myself. They'd been recording not just video but audio, capturing every word, every frightened breath, every desperate question I'd asked into the phone. My own voice, distorted and rearranged, asked me, "Have you checked the children? Did you really check them carefully? Are you sure you know where they really are?" I spent the remainder of the night trying to find a way out of the house while being taunted by people who treated my terror as entertainment. Every room I explored contained cameras and recording equipment. Every escape attempt was observed and commented on, like I was a rat in a maze being studied by scientists. The fake children provided running commentary on my behavior, discussing my stress, responses and problem-solving approaches, like I was an interesting specimen rather than a human being in genuine distress. At exactly 6 a.m., the security system deactivated and the doors unlocked with a soft electronic chime. The surveillance operator from the third floor appeared in the living room, now dressed in an expensive suit, like he was heading to a business meeting. "Thank you for participating in our research," he said politely, like I'd volunteered for this experience instead of being tricked and trapped. "Your responses have provided valuable data about teenage decision-making under extreme stress. You'll find your payment in an envelope by the front door, along with a non-disclosure agreement that we strongly encourage you to sign." I ran from that house without looking back, without taking their money, without signing anything they wanted me to sign. I drove straight to the police station and tried to report what had happened, but when officers went to investigate, they found the mansion empty, with no signs that anyone had been living there recently. The elaborate surveillance equipment was gone, the fake children had disappeared, and there was no evidence that the psychological torture I'd experienced had actually occurred. The address I'd been given led to a house that had been on the market for months, and the phone numbers the Hendersons had used were disconnected. My experience had been so carefully planned and executed that it left no trace, no evidence, no way to prove that it had happened except for my own traumatic memories. The police took my report, but explained that without physical evidence or identifiable suspects, there wasn't much they could do except add it to their files of unsolved incidents. I never babysat again, and I still have nightmares about houses with too many rooms and phones that ring at midnight with distorted voices asking about children who aren't really children. The trust I used to have in families who seemed normal and homes that appeared safe was completely destroyed that night, replaced by a constant awareness that the people who seem most trustworthy might be the ones with the most elaborate facades, hiding their true intentions. If a babysitting job seems too good to be true, if the family offers unusually high pay for supposedly easy work, if the parents are vague about their background or provide contact information that seems suspicious, trust your instincts and walk away. Some families are looking for babysitters to care for their children, but others are looking for victims to study, torment, or worse. The beautiful houses and wealthy families that seem like dream employers might be nightmares in disguise, and once you're inside their homes with their security systems activated, you might discover that you're not an employee, you're an experiment.